Olá, o TVMP Entrevista de hoje é com Stephen Kenneth Talpins. Ele é subprocurador-geral de Justiça de Miami. Participa da Semana do MP com uma palestra sobre Smart Justice, que é a justiça inteligente, o trabalho da Kristi House de prevenção de crimes e proteção a crianças e o trabalho de assistência a vítimas realizado na Flórida. Thank you very much for coming to TVMP for this interview. You're very welcome.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Mr. Talpins, you have a long career in the justice system. How was it in 1992 when you started compared to the work you do now?
Oh my God. It's changed dramatically since I started in 1992. It's hard to believe it's been that long. When I started in the criminal justice system, I came in with the mindset that we had to be tough on crime. That if somebody committed a crime, we needed to send them to jail. No matter what they did, they were going to jail or they were going to prison. That was my mindset. That was the generation I grew up in. Then in about 2003, I got a fellowship with a federal agency, and I was asked to go around the country and talk about DUI treatment courts. These are courts that are designed to help people address their criminogenic needs. And specifically DUI offenders, and usually revolving around alcohol, but certainly other drugs as well. And I refused. I told them, no, I'm not going to do that. And my program manager said to me, well, what do you mean no? I said, treatment doesn't work. And she said, well, what do you think works? I said, jail. She said, what do you do when they get out of jail? I said, well, I send them back. She said, what do you do when they get out of jail a second time? I said, well, then I obviously send them to prison. Thought it was a trick question. And she said to me, well, you know, your boss's boss's boss, Kathy Fernandez Rundle, created the first drug court in the world. And I said, yeah, I was young, stupid, arrogant, you know, the usual. And so she said to me, you know, you go do your due diligence. And if you still feel that way, we'll figure out what to do with you. And I thought, I'm going to prove them all wrong. And I set out literally to kill the drug court movement because I was so convinced that incarceration was the answer to everything. So I set out to kill this whole movement, and I spent hundreds of hours on the internet. I read literally everything published on DUI courts, drug courts, treatment in general, everything I can find. And after spending all that time, I learned that I did not know everything and that I was wrong. I was on the wrong side of the issue, and I like to say I've spent the rest of my career doing penance for my mistakes and talking to other people about the importance of looking at people as individuals and addressing their needs when we can.
Is this the smart justice?
It is. It is. The idea is to address people as individuals, look at not just their crimes, but look at who they are and try to get an idea of what we need to do with them and deal with them in a very, very strategic way. Rehabilitate those we can, incarcerate those we must.
And who does one thing another in the system, in the justice system? Who is committed to the crime sentence and the treatment?
Okay, so you know that's actually it sounds like such a simple question, and in some ways it is, but the answer is so complex. What we do is when someone comes into our system, we try to figure out who they are, and we figure out what their needs are, and we also look at what they did. So it's not really a focus on one thing or the other. It's kind of the totality of the circumstances. So we have programs that are designed for certain people who commit very low-level offenses, who have no priors, and we give police the discretion to keep them out of the system altogether. It's a civil citation program. So somebody goes out, they commit a petty theft, it's a minor crime, they've got no priors, they generally have been law-abiding their whole lives. The officers have the ability to issue them a civil ticket instead of arresting them and taking them to jail. It's up to the officer. Why? Because they're in the street and they are interacting with this person and they're best situated at that time to make that decision. So that's an example of a pre-arrest diversion. We also have post-arrest diversion. Somebody comes into the system, they don't have any priors, and they've done something stupid, and it's obvious they have some kind of drug problem or something else. We can then put them in a diversion program where their charges may be dropped, or depending on the circumstances, they may get a lesser sentence than they would have gotten if they didn't participate in the program. So we've got all sorts of different programs, and it really depends on who we're dealing with, what their priors look like, and what crimes they committed. Obviously, somebody who commits a murder or a rape or an armed robbery, those are the kind of people we're really trying to focus our attention on. We're really using our resources on, and those are the kind of people that we're going to be sending to jail and prison.
How do you keep monitoring these ones who commit crimes?
There's a couple different ways to do that. So obviously, if we're in prison, we're not worried about them committing a new crime out in the general public because they're incarcerated. For those who are not in prison, we have a couple different mechanisms to do this. One is if they're in a program, then whoever is administering the program will be watching them to some extent. And it may be as simple as looking out for new arrest, or it may be more intensive than that, where the person's required to come in and report on a regular basis. We also have probation. We have misdemeanor probation and we have felony probation. Either way, there's a probation officer assigned, and that probation officer is responsible for managing that person's case and ensuring that they get the services they're supposed to get and making sure that they stay out of trouble. In felonies, we have a higher level probation, if you will, that we refer to as community control. In community control, the person is still out in the community, but they may be subjected to house arrest, and it's a lot more stringent. So we'll impose curfews, we'll put them on house arrest, either a radio frequency bracelet where they have to be within a certain distance of a receiver, or a GPS bracelet which tells us their exact location if we need to keep them out of certain locations and in specific ones. So there's a whole bunch of different ways we do that.
Let's talk about the Kristi House. What's the origin of this and how does it work?
Oh God, Kristi House is amazing. I absolutely love our victim programs, and this is like the perfect example of the kind of things we try to do for our victims. So Kristi House is at least the program you're talking about is a one-stop shop for our victims. And essentially it employs a multidisciplinary approach. Basically all the players who are stakeholders essentially use this building as the place where they're going to interact with the victims of child sexual abuse. And again, it's just such a great example of the kind of things that Kathy Fernandez-Rundle has put together. So the way it works is a child is a victim of a very serious sex crime. Usually we're talking about kids under 12, horrific crimes. And they come to this place and it's specifically designed with the child in mind. So they come to the place and there's lots of colors and decorations and toys and things like that. We're seeing the child typically after they go through the worst experience they'll ever go through, so we try to make them as comfortable as possible. We're never going to make them entirely comfortable. It's just not possible. The trauma is too severe. But we're at least trying to turn down the temperature, trying to help them get through the process and trying to investigate a case in a way that will allow us to prosecute the perpetrator, to protect the public from further misconduct and criminal activity, while at the same time respecting the need to protect the child at that moment, not re-traumatize them, taking them through the process. So they'll come to the center. It's a very welcoming atmosphere. Everybody is extremely nice. We go out of our way to interact with the child. The child's given opportunity to play toys, to expend energy. We have tricycles, we have a basketball hoop, the whole thing, everything you can think about. Ultimately, the child will be interviewed by somebody who's a forensic interviewer. These are people who are specially trained to do interviews in criminal cases. The ones we use for the children are specially trained to deal with children. Many of these children will have special needs. They're prepared for all that and they can handle that. When they interview the child, they do it in a room that's very calm, kind of like the studio right now, nice big chairs where they get comfortable. There are books and magazines and comics that the kids can read. There's crayons and papers and coloring books and things like that. Anything to engage them and try to get them to be able to relax. Within the room, they'll be sitting with the interviewer and there'll be a one-way mirror. On the other side of the mirror will be a camera and somebody monitoring the interview. And we do it that way because it's hard enough for the child to talk about what. I mean, can you imagine this poor child, everything they've gone through, now they have to talk about it and answer questions about it. And then you're going to add a camera sticking in their face. It's just not going to work. So it's behind a one-way mirror so they can't see it and they don't realize they're being filmed typically. Obviously, if they're a little older, they could be told. But for especially the young ones, they don't really understand the process. And we also have an examining room. So instead of them having to go to a whole bunch of different locations and keep reliving what's gone on, all this takes place in one facility. And the parents, of course, are there the whole way.
And other victims, do they have special assistance? We see on TV that unit of crime, special crimes unit. Do you have
The
this?
Special Victims Unit?
Yeah.
Sure. Everyone's seen LA Law.
Yeah.
that show's been great. I love that show. So we don't, ours isn't called the Special Victims Unit. We have a Sexual Battery and Child Abuse Unit, which would be the equivalent of the SVU. We have Human Trafficking Unit, we have a Gang Unit, we have Robbery, we have a whole bunch of Elderly and Vulnerable Victims Unit. So we have a ton of different units for different things, and all of our units are geared specifically to the types of case that unit handles. So another good example that would probably interest you is our domestic violence unit. Mm-hmm. So our domestic violence office, which predates the Kristi House, is set up in a similar kind of way. It's set up, there's a specific room where they have books and all sorts of games and stuffed animals that children could interact with and play with while their parents are being interviewed, because we have a child care issue in a lot of those cases. But a lot of those kids are also victims. They've seen the abuse themselves. They may be victims, or they may be witnesses. So the rooms are designed, again, to make them as comfortable as possible, either while they're being interviewed or while their parents are being interviewed. We have all sorts of brochures and packets that are geared toward the adults of the particular crimes that we're dealing with. A domestic violence victim typically needs to be educated in a different way than a robbery victim. We have pamphlets that explain our victims' rights. We have all sorts of victim rights in Florida. There's been an amendment to our Constitution, which the state attorney long supported. She was a big advocate of it. And not surprisingly, it mirrors our office policies. Things we've been doing for decades under Kathy's leadership now is actually required under Florida law. Why was it done that way? Because while we were doing it, other offices, other jurisdictions were not. And people looked at what Kathy was doing, saying, this is what everyone should be doing. Everyone deserves this level of treatment. So they took what we're doing in Miami, and they took it and made it statewide.
And how does all this work affects the crime rate and the population in prison?
You know, it's funny because I get asked that question all the time. Well, if you've reduced your reliance on incarceration, which we've done, what has that done to the crime rate? Because if we reduced our rate of incarceration, but the crime rate is skyrocketed, obviously that's not a good way to do things. So we did take a look at the crime rates, and Kathy became state attorney in 1993, so 30 years ago. In the 30 years since she became state attorney, the crime rate in Miami-Dade County has dropped more than 75%. It's dropped more than 75% for violent crime rate, and more than 75% for property crime rate. So of course we have to put that into context, and we have to ask ourselves, is it because of something we're doing in Miami that's special, or is it because crime rate's dropping everywhere? Because we all know crime has dropped everywhere across the United States as a general rule. So we compared the drop in Miami's crime rate to the drop in Florida's crime rate. We wanted to know, is it a Miami effect, or is it a Florida effect, or is it both? And what we learned is that Miami's violent property crime rates were much, much higher than Florida's in 1993. That gap has narrowed considerably. And that tells us that yes, there's something happening in Florida, but there's something much bigger happening in Miami, something special happening in Miami that's different, because the drop in our crime rate is much higher than it is for the state of Florida. So the question becomes, what is that something? And there's a whole host of answers to that questions. But we believe that those of us in law enforcement, the police and the prosecutors, we get a lot of credit for that. And we think a lot of it is the shift from incarcerating everybody to incarcerating those we have to, the people who are truly dangerous, and then focusing our jail and prison resources on them, but focusing our other resources, our rehabilitative resources, on those who are going to be open to it and who are likely to be changed by it. So by rehabilitating those we help them avoid getting into a pattern where they end up in the other category. You know, we help them break the cycle before they do something where we have to incarcerate them.
Thank you very much for this interview. You're very welcome to be here whenever you want.
Thank you. It's been a great honor. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. A você que esteve nos assistindo, continue ligado na programação da TVMP. A gente volta em breve.
Obrigado.